Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the alternative MacTaggart, which this year is taking the shape of a Q&A because Brian wanted me to do all the hard work. At least that's how I've taken it. We are, in fact, Eric Schmidt's worst nightmare. As he detailed last night, you have a boffin and a lovey. So we're going to struggle through and attempt to overcome the stereotypes. I'm going to try and get my head around astrophysics, and then Brian's going to try and get his head around, or at least translate my rather worldly questions. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end of about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. If you tweet anything worth mentioning, and I remember to look at the screen and pick up the tweets, you need to know #Pentland. We may refer to them as we go through. But let's just get started. I think people will come in as the session progresses, so just ignore them. Don't hiss latecomer or anything mean. Brian, it's been said that the numbers of physics students rose by 5% since 2007, which I think neatly coincides with your television career, your ascent to the heights. Do you believe in the Brian Cox effect?
I mean, it's interesting. I think it goes to the heart of the debate, actually, about the power of television, which is what we're talking about here. Whether or not you believe it, and there's analysis to be done. I mean, certainly university admissions figures are up substantially as well. Physics was up, I think, 19%, astronomy 38%. So these are big increases in the interest. And it's complicated because there may be a delay in so these programs, the BBC Year of Science, for example, in 2010, whether that effect has had time to move through or not is debatable. But if you accept for the moment that there probably is some contribution to the increase in interest in science and engineering, then it poses, I think, a lot of interesting questions that I suppose we'll talk about. I mean, one is that if you accept it, that means that a UK broadcaster, the BBC, by programming choices, by putting programs on, if you look at the Year of Science and before, wonders of the solar system, wonders of the universe, how the Earth made us. You've got Alice Roberts' programs, Human Journey. You've got then Jim Al-Khalili's programs, Atom, Adam Rutherford, Cell. The History of Science, Michael Mosley. It's a huge number of essentially landmark, expensive television documentaries about science. And if that has changed the way that kids look at science, and it's increased the number of kids going into university, that's an effect of national importance. I mean, I'm also involved a lot, of course, as an academic and in science policy. For years, we've been talking, the Royal Society Institute of Physics, about how we change around the downward trend for the sake, not only culturally of Britain, but the economic health of Britain, as Eric Schmidt said last night. So for probably a confluence of reasons, that's happened now. So we've seen a rise again. I mean, the challenge, to be political about it, is to the government, is to what are you going to do about that? Because there you are. There's a gift being given to you.
Is there also a sense, though, that things like the greenhouse effect and the idea that we're talking about the ozone and what's happening to the Earth's atmosphere and things has actually put science back on the agenda as well? And also for university students these days, since it costs them so much to go to university, you don't want to do sort of silly degrees like media studies. Sorry, no offense, but they want to tackle meaty subjects that can lead them somewhere in their subsequent careers.
There's several. I mean, you could also point to the financial crisis and say that there's been a shift away from finance, and so there's a lot of reasons. But I think it is fair to say that we know that television has a very important part to play in influencing young people and just influencing a society. So we can argue about how much influence it has, but it has quite a lot. So this is key then. So I think the key question we will talk about, I suppose, is
you should be doing a lecture, really, shouldn't you?
Well, yeah, no way.
I'm going to go and stand behind the curtain.
I mean, there are questions like, could another broadcaster do that?
I'm going to ask you that question, but first, I thought that we could talk a little bit just about first of all, this kind of phenomenon, as we've been discussing. We'll come back to talk about what broadcasters could have done it, and perhaps also whether the BBC has this responsibility as an educator and so on. But first, I mean, does 6 million viewers watching a program about the second law of thermodynamics, does it sort of constitute a revolution, an appetite for the subject, or is it a phenomenon brought about by the fact that you're not a white-coated, horn-rimmed scientist with a dry delivery?
No, I mean, I think that, and I see this when I go into schools and also when I teach at university, that there's a genuine appetite for these ideas. I mean, they are obviously the big questions that everybody talks about in the pub, about where did we come from, what happened at the Big Bang, etc., etc.
Which pub?
Yeah. Well, when I'm in the pub, they all come to me and ask. That's what my life is now, is explaining thermodynamics to people in pubs instead of drinking. It used to be what I did.
It's a job,
pubs,
you
but,
know.
Yeah. but so I think, again, in a broadcasting sense, what I think has happened is if you put these things on, and you, my executive producer Andrew Cohen has a phrase for it, which is giving people permission to watch, which we think a lot about. It's like, given that people are interested in these subjects, how do you allow them to switch on and see it, to see the programme start and not get scared and not turn off and then engage with it? But given that, it's not surprising to me that on BBC Two at 9 o'clock on Sunday night, you can carry the audience from, you know, Top Gear, let's say, through, and you don't need to lose them if you get it right. So I think the ideas are fascinating if you present them in the right way.
And specifically on the programmes themselves, in terms of the Wonders series, was the amazing thing about those two series the numbers of people who were watching, or the scientific revelations? Were they equally groundbreaking? Is that part of your remit? Do you see it, or are you taking things from a much more sort of base level?
I mean, there are some simple things we had, some sort of philosophy behind the style of the series. One was that I wanted to explain at least one or two physical concepts in detail, and we did it not by using graphics. I mean, one of the big ideas in Wonders of the Solar System was to say, if I'm going to explain something complex, then put me somewhere where I can refer to something. If I'm talking about volcanic activity on the moon of Io, put me in front of a volcano, but let me explain it to the camera. So don't do the traditional thing, which I've never understood in television, where you put a presenter there and they go, "This is a volcano." It's like, well, yeah, it is. You don't need to say that. I mean, and then go to graphics to explain what's happening. So there were some conscious shifts in style.
But who came up with the brilliant little experiments, just while we're on that subject? Like the one that we were particularly taken with in my house was the umbrella, the tin can,
yeah,
and the thermometer in order to prove the strength of the sun.
It's an interesting example of the way that the team work together. We have a small team, which I think is also very important to say, actually. So there are not that many voices. It's one of the reasons is that I think we think, in hindsight, Solar System was made under the radar to some extent. I mean, I don't think there were great expectations, although it was quite an expensive series. So we were left alone. But so the director, I think, really, he had an idea. He thought a black umbrella in front of Death Valley would look good, I think. And as I remember it, that was his driving force behind it. It was an artistic choice, like the boffins against loveys. That was Lovey, I think.
That was
and then it was almost like.
But the boffin wanted the umbrella in the first place, I presume.
It's almost like, could we do something with this? You know, I mean, obviously he had in mind this experiment, which was a famous experiment. And actually, that was one of the iconic kind of moments of the series, I think, and it was because of an ad lib at the end. As I was saying it, I realised I have calculated the energy output of the sun using a tin of water with an umbrella and a thermometer, and I said that's why I love physics, and it was kind of one of those things that, interestingly, the academic community have not always been entirely supportive of science broadcasting, because obviously there's some sense in which you summarise the science rather than going into depth. But they really supported Solar System. And I think in hindsight, although it wasn't planned, it was because there was that kind of engagement from one scientist to another. This is why we do science. Very early on in the series, almost accidentally, actually.
And I did interrupt you as you were explaining whether it was groundbreaking science or a kind of mission to educate that spurred the sort of the inspiration for the programs.
I mean, there's obviously several reasons why something like that gets commissioned. I mean, one was just the BBC had not done a solar system series for 10 years, and a lot of new information, new space probes and missions had come in. But for me, I mean, I have a very clear agenda, which is because I'm still an academic, I'm in a university, I have a slogan which is make Britain the best place in the world to do science and engineering. And I keep saying
really
it
a slogan.
I want it to be a slogan. I want David Cameron to stand there and make it a speech and say, I want to make Britain the best place in the world to do science and engineering. What should we do about it? So that's for me, that's an old-fashioned, actually, way of making television, I think. I mean, I grew up being very heavily influenced by Cosmos, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and there's a very strong element of polemic in that series. I mean, particularly the 13th episode is the one everybody talks about, which is essentially a polemical attack on nuclear war, because it was made in the late 70s when that was the great threat to civilization. And so I think that, and if you look back over Civilization as a series, the Clarke series, and you could have Bronowski's series, The Ascent of Man, there's a strong element of polemic in them. And that's in solar system and universe, and it's a celebration and I suppose
yours is much more upbeat. Yours is much more of a celebration. You talk about they were polemics. There were polemics about certain issues, as it were. Whereas yours does seem to be much more about drawing our attention to, literally, the wonder of it. I mean, there's a sort of religiosity about the language and the sense of awe that you display.
It's true, but you'll see there is a polemical basis. It's building an argument in support of science, engineering, and exploration. And as Eric Schmidt said yesterday, I thought it was a wonderful observation, which I support very strongly, is it's almost a Victorian and pre-Victorian ideal. And we shouldn't be ashamed of that. I think if the 20th century did something terrible to philosophy, in my opinion, it was generate things like postmodernism, utter shit, right? And the point is that there's a great quote, one of my favourite quotes from Humphrey Davy, who's one of the great scientists, headed the Royal Society 1780, 1790, 1800, and he was in response to a question, well, why should we continue to explore? He said, nothing is more fatal to the progress of the human mind than to presume that our views of science are ultimate, that our triumphs are complete, that there are no mysteries in nature and there are no new worlds to conquer. Now it's a summary of an ideal, which is what should a society do? And that element, you're right, there's a sense of wonder there. It's a sense of how do I react to the beauty and power of nature? But the idea then that you've got to remind a society to go and explore and to invest in science and engineering, it's overt in the series, actually.
But that was Schmidt's point, wasn't it? That basically in this country we'd almost favoured art above science, and that boffin, the term itself, was a sort of derogatory, dismissive term, and in a way exemplified how we feel and think about science.
Yeah, I think it's a very old-fashioned distinction, actually. I think that it's this two cultures idea, the famous two cultures idea of Snow, that's gone, in my opinion. I mean, now what you have is you have culture, and you have a society, and a society invests, and universities operate, and they are just that. They are universities. They're universal places. And so I think that the idea that there are silos, it certainly in academia, is very unfashionable. It's gone away. It's not correct. In broadcasting, you maybe see some remnants of that. And I think that's where I disagreed with Eric Schmidt, actually, to an extent. I think that choice, just unfettered choice, so the fact that you leave people to say, well, I am interested in art, so I'll watch this channel, or I'm interested in science. This is what you see in the US. So my programs in the US are on the Science Channel. So unless you want to go to the Science Channel, you don't see my programs, or any programs about science, actually, in general. So to me, that's not choice, right? The absolute choice removes choice because it doesn't give people the ability to come to things with serendipity.
But it's an argument that then goes to the heart of sort of public service broadcasting, doesn't it? Because if you're setting yourself up as a broadcaster whose mission is to educate and illuminate, and you're going to take risks, you can't really afford to do that in a commercial, profit, versus ratings world. I mean, your program is an exception in that it's been monstrously successful, far more successful than people might have imagined when they first set out to make it.
It's a very interesting point, though, because now, I mean, even now, when it comes to question to the audience, I mean, even now, given the success, so you have, viewing figures of 6 million, you have 200,000 books sold, 200,000, all these things, you can see the commercial success of that franchise. But even now, are the funding models in place? If I said to Channel 4, I want to go make Wonders of Life, which is the next one, I want to make it there. I want to make 5 hours of landmark documentary television on Channel 4. Is the funding model there to do it? It's an interesting question. It's not at all clear. And then the point you make that actually, in any case, it would have been a huge commercial risk. It would have never happened. You would never get whatever they are, £800,000 an episode or whatever it is. You'd never get that. I don't think, with an unknown presenter, which I was at the time, about the solar system, an unfashionable subject at the time. I don't think it would work.
But it also does the Brian Cox effect, as it were, that you choose to ignore, and I understand why. Does it actually have a crossover to other people in the field? So is everyone now looking for a new Brian Cox so they can make their Wonders of the Universe? Or is there an appetite for actual science programming that might be as obscure or as interesting or as inspired as anything you've done?
I'd hope so. So I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to see whether on, let's say, so the BBC Two, so Channel 4, or Channel 5, or ITV, or Sky, I know, have done it to a sense with Attenborough, with them, and Sky Arts, yeah. So whether that does happen. And it comes down to the fundamental issue, I think, about one of the reasons the BBC is valuable, in my opinion, is that if it doesn't happen, it tells you something very important, which is that for this particular kind of programming, certainly, there is no other way of doing it, right? This is the way you do it. And if indeed you go back to the proposition that you made at the start, that these figures, this upswing in interest in science, is partly a result of that choice by the BBC, how valuable does it make that institution as a public service? Right, as one of the great public institutions, how should we value it? Should it be the case, as it is at the moment, that the BBC, if you say what's it going to look like in 10 years, it may not be able to do that. And the question is not, is that good, in my view, is that good for the market? I mean, I almost don't care about the broadcasting market. I'm an academic. I don't mind about the level playing field for people to make money.
I suppose.
What I care about is given that television has a big impact on our society, how do you use it to make our society better? That's the key thing for me. And in that context, how do you look at the licence fee? And how do you look at public service broadcasting?
But isn't that an argument for the BBC that the BBC should perhaps be making?
Well, I'm making it. So if the BBC wants me to make arguments on its behalf, I can do it.
By ITV, what happens then?
I mean, this is interesting because actually, I am an academic, although the amount of time I spend on it at the moment is minimal. But I am at the University of Manchester. I'm a university research fellow for the Royal Society, and so in that guise, what am I interested in? I'm interested in making Britain a more scientific place. Why? Because 6.9% of our GDP comes from physics-based industry, for example, which is more than comes from financial services. So everybody accepts the fact, and Eric Schmidt made the point very well last night that high-tech industry, knowledge-intensive services and industry is the jargon term. Those are the future, right? So, and that includes media, because that's a knowledge-intensive services industry. So how do you maintain that foundation? Now, I think my proposal is that the public service broadcasting has a very important role to play in, I suppose, changing the direction of a society. When you think about putting things into little silos and about giving people choice and allowing people to ghettoize themselves into the areas that they're interested, without almost this kind of Reithian ideal of very unfashionably and very bluntly saying, well, you don't necessarily know what's best for you, right? No, there's appropriate caveats around that, but you know what I mean. That to me is, that's very important. It's a very important context in the debate about where our media goes. I think it plays a big role in allowing change to happen. And if you allow people to ghettoize, you make it very difficult for change to happen. I mean, I've had this interesting, I have a lot of friends in the US. I discuss a lot because those media stories about the upswing in science went across the Atlantic, and they were used by a lot of people in America to say, well, could this happen in America? You know, how did Britain turn around this decline in science and engineering? How has it done it? And if you accept the fact it's the media, it almost can't be done in America because it's already so riven with the doctrine of choice, in a sense, that you don't have any national broadcasters, either public service or commercial, to get that audience. You know, 10% of the population watching a science program does have the chance. There's a possibility that can make a difference.
You talk about it having turned around, but isn't there a danger as well that it'll end up like sort of cooking programs, you know, where everyone wants to watch cooking programs, but actually when they do the research, it turns out that nobody's cooking, you know. Everyone might want to watch wonderful, beautiful imagery, you emoting about these extraordinary mysteries of the universe, but you know, for us to move ahead in terms of science and engineering, it requires investment and attention from the government. It requires a change in school syllabuses, again, something that you know, Eric Schmidt pointed out last night. You know, there are so many other factors that need to be incorporated.
This is the key difference between cooking and science, is that science does, and the university sector as a whole, and this area underpins about half our economy. So it's a genuinely important question. You know, the companies, the big companies in Britain, Rolls-Royce, BAE Systems, AstraZeneca, these are companies that require that throughput of scientists and engineers in order to underpin our economy.
So why do you think we're so apathetic about, why do you think we're so apathetic then about the subjects? Why do you think there aren't more young people going, I want to be an engineer?
That's the thing, there are now. So I think, you know, it's obviously complicated, but I think there is a shift now, and I would contend that part of that is to do with particularly the BBC's commitment to science broadcasting. And I named some, there's a lot of it, and it's doing very well. And it's bang goes the theory as well. It's across all channels. It's important that it's across all channels. And it's a commitment. And then you ask yourself, and it's quite unfashionable again sometimes to ask these questions. You ask yourself, what is it like when you go into the BBC? So I'm not an employee of the BBC in a sense, although I make programmes for them. So I go in, and you say, well, when you sit there in the science department, what is the motivation for these people? What are they doing? What's the conversation that I have with them about what programmes we should put on? And they're driven by a genuine desire to put good science on television. They're not driven by ratings. I mean, we tend to, from Janice Hadlow at BBC Two, always says to both myself and Andrew, I don't really mind. Honestly, and I believe her. I don't mind I don't mind whether you get 2 million people. I'd love it if you get 6 million, but I don't mind. Go and make the best programme that you can. And that's kind of almost a cliche, but I think it's genuinely true in a world that is not subject to commercial pressure in the same sense, that you can have the freedom to experiment and to engage with this rather wider goal, in my view anyway. What
inspired you to go into the field of scientific endeavour? I mean, there wasn't a Brian Cox, there was a Carl Sagan, I suppose. But you know, now when students at conferences, when they've stopped screaming at your appearance, turn around and start asking the questions about, you know, how they can do it and so on, would you recommend a period perhaps as a pop star, just I don't know, to sort of limber up? What do you say to them, and what do you think has made you the sort of phenomenon that you are?
I mean, in terms of what I say to kids, actually, and I always say this, the reason I've been able to make programmes on television is because I went away and got a degree and a PhD, actually. So when kids ask me, how should I get into science broadcasting? I say, well, first of all, go and be a scientist. And that's actually very interesting. It's a big shift over the last few years in the media, that you look back and there was a nasty period, in my view, where you thought you have to have a celebrity to present this programme, right? It's a celebrity doing a science programme, a celebrity this and that. Actually, what's happened, if you look at the BBC's record, is that it's myself and Ian Stewart and Jamal Khalili and Adam Rutherford and Alice Roberts, academics, right? So what a conscious decision was made to turn academics into television presenters, stroke celebrities, whatever you want. That's really important. And that sends a strong message, actually. It says that it's not like an X Factor message. It's the opposite in a way. It's like if you want to be on television, then be a scientist or be a historian or do that, and then you can go on to television.
Are the two roles complementary? Because I sort of imagine that on the one hand, in terms of your academic career, it's very much about looking for breakthroughs and finding answers. Whereas the impression I'm getting about the television programs is that it's more a sort of evangelical educational process for you, so that they would seem to differ in terms of what they take up of your scientific mind.
It's interesting that the scheme I'm funded by at the moment is a Royal Society scheme called the University Research Fellowship. And its job is to make scientific leaders by giving them freedom. And that really is. And in general, what happens is that you do that by having a very strong research career and just do that. But there is another strand to it, which is, what does it mean to be a scientific leader? Well, raising the profile of science in a democracy is not just a kind of a thing you need to do. It's not a luxury. It's not, well, it would be nice if people supported it. In competitive funding environments, as we've seen, if you want funding, government funding to universities and to research, you need public support for it. So it's actually not only about encouraging kids, it's actually saying this is what science does. This is what you have paid for as a taxpayer. This is why you should pay for more. And actually one of the reasons I really became very interested in being on television and making programs was back in 2007, when I'd not done very much. There was a funding crisis in physics, which was caused, as far as anyone can see, by a mistake, a civil service mistake. I think we don't go into the details, but it looks like it was a mistake. But it resulted in a 20% cut in funding for physics and astronomy, so for PhD places, a big hit for no reason. There was no economic crisis at that time. The reason, as far as you can see, and I got very annoyed about it, was that government essentially thought that nobody cared. So they didn't really think, there's not going to be headlines about this, it's not a big deal. All right, we've made a bit of a cock-up, but it's all right, we'll just... Actually, that's now probably not the case. Probably now. If you said we're going to close Jodrell Bank, then I think there'd be a big public outcry about it, where that was spoken about in 2007, because you just thought, well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you talked about the importance of the BBC, and really it is pretty much only the BBC who could afford to make these huge epics, you know, with you being jetted from one side of the planet to the next. But is there a different way, a sort of guerrilla way of making science programs that perhaps other stations could be looking at in terms of capitalizing on the interest of the public, if that is actually there, and making a different style of program? Because yours is actually in the great grand tradition, isn't it, in many ways? And it is what the BBC does brilliantly. It's mesmerizing to watch, it's epic in every way. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what other broadcasters do, given the viewing figures across the board for science seem to be very high at the moment. And as you rightly say, it's not just for these epics. I mean, we made for example, the stargazing program, which is just a live thing over 3 nights, very straightforward, 3 hours. And that was very successful. It had over 3 million viewers in that slot, again, on BBC Two. So yeah, to recognise that this genre is not a niche genre, it's actually a prime time, big ratings thing, I think is hopefully what's changed.
Do you think it's something that British television excels at? I mean, are there examples from around the world that are better?
No. It is, I think. I mean, and again, it may be down to the fragmentation. If you look in America, I mean, I know that Discovery Channel, the Science Channel, has a big success of the Morgan Freeman show over there, The Universe, which does very well for them. And of course, Cosmos was made by PBS, essentially, with partners, and Cosmos has been remade. This is very interesting, actually. So Andrianne, who's Carl Sagan's widow, they've teamed up with the producer of Family Guy and Fox and Nat Geo to remake Cosmos. Big budget, 13 hours on prime time, again. in 2013, I think, in the US. That potentially will change the broadcasting landscape in the US with regards to science. I know other networks now are beginning to look at, does that mean science should be on prime time? Because Fox have done it, right? Fox are going to do it. So it's interesting, actually. But at the moment, that's the example of the US market doing what the BBC do, I think. But that's got a huge heritage. That's Cosmos.
I know you want to talk a bit about the Science is Vital campaign, but just to sort of springboard that in a way, can you explain why science is vital?
Yeah, it's very simple. Half our economy is built on it, pretty much.
So it's only a money thing. You see, I think that in a way diminishes why it's vital.
It's obvious to me. I mean, the reason we're not living in caves is because of science. But it's very important to say that. It's this way of looking at the world, this idea, the scientific method, the fact that you do experiments, you come up with a theory, you test it. If it doesn't agree with nature, then it's wrong and you throw it away. It doesn't matter what your opinion is, doesn't matter how important you are, doesn't matter what your title is. If you disagree with the experiment, it's wrong. That has built the modern world self-evidently. So to me, it's almost, it almost doesn't need saying, but of course it does, because science is seen, and this goes back to broadcasting again, sometimes as another genre. It's not just another genre. It's the thing is the reason we live beyond the age of 20. It's the reason infant mortality is not really an issue in Britain anymore. Why? Because of science. It's the reason that we have everything. It's the reason that we have a broadcasting industry. It's so obvious. But actually, so that means that its position in popular culture has to be in a prime seat in popular culture. It cannot be ghettoised. It should not be on some channel where people who are boffins can subscribe and watch science fiction and science, as Eric was kind of referring to. It has to be centre stage. So the question is, how do we do that? Well, we've done it to some extent, but the challenge, again, to be provocative, is the BBC's done it, right? So is it possible for other broadcasters to do it? Do they want to? Could they do it if they wanted to? And would it make commercial sense?
Well, we'll hopefully hear from some of the broadcasters in a moment. But before we go to the audience, and we will be coming to you in about 5 minutes, please think of some questions for us. What did you make of the recent Steve Jones report on the BBC's science output?
I mean, I essentially agreed with it. I mean, the bit that really crossed over with things I've been saying, I think in the RTS lecture, the Hugh Weldon lecture last year, I made this very clear point, which is that the scientific consensus, the peer-reviewed scientific consensus, should be the basis of news reporting, of television reporting. So it's a very interesting thing for a news journalist, I think, if you look at the concept of balance. That what does balance mean in the context of, let's say, climate change? Let's pick a very controversial area. What does balance mean? Well, the balance in terms of here's some data, here's a model, here's the prediction about what will happen, and here are the errors on that prediction. That's got all the balance built into it that you could possibly see is the peer-reviewed consensus. There's no agreement on the details in particular, but the general trend is agreed on. So you have to report that. To then have a critic give an equal weight on something like Newsnight or Channel 4 News to argue against it gives a false impression to the audience. Because actually, the peer-reviewed consensus is just that. It's the peer-reviewed consensus. Very importantly, though, you've got to separate that from the politics of what you do about it. So it's a legitimate political position to say, I don't think we should do anything about that. I'm happy for the world to warm and the market will deal with it. Or it would be nice, actually, because we can grow vines to the south of England and have a wine industry. You know, these might be a ludicrous thing to say, but that's political. So I thought that particular part of the report was very important. That it almost sounds arrogant, but it isn't if you understand what science is, because it's apolitical, it's a-religious, it's a-moral in many senses. It's a process, the best process we have for getting to the best answer that we have. It might not be right, but it's the best process. So it's got to be reported as such. Otherwise, you mislead.
The rumoured cuts to BBC4, again, another sort of negative impact one imagines on science output.
Yeah. I mean, it's very worrying, I think, that, from my perspective. I mean, the first programme I made was on BBC 4. You look at Jim Al-Khalili's award-winning programmes, like The Atom, and you look at Adam Rutherford's Cell, Marcus de Sautoy's programmes have now transferred to BBC 2, but they started on BBC 4. So, and as I say, there's two things to say. One is, clearly the BBC is forced to make cuts, and that's a different question. That's about the level of the licence fee. So it's almost like, well, what do you expect, first of all? If you cut an organisation's revenue stream, then things are going to get lost. So I can see why the debate is being had. But as I say, I would fundamentally disagree with the logic of making a particular channel, labelling it in a particular way, because I don't think, just philosophically, there's any distinction between science and arts and history and culture. I think what you're talking about is documentary. So documentary, what box would a history of the discovery of the structure of the atom go in?
But are you against specialist programming across the board, or just the idea that science should only find its place? I mean, are you talking about a sort of balanced diet in a way?
Yeah, I think a documentary is a documentary. And I don't like the idea of, I think the strength of public service broadcasting, this basic Reithian ideal, actually, of having a channel that Radio 4 is a great example, actually. You listen to Radio 4, and you're taken from Gardner's Question Time to something about science to something to PM. And I think that idea of being able to have a place where people can be exposed to new ideas, because they don't, we go back to that idea that genuine choice is not having your choice so restricted that you just do what you want. Genuine choice is saying, here's a menu of things. You need to be exposed to it. So I don't agree with the idea of having niche channels. I think it's negative.
I think you've made that point very clear indeed. I'm going to just read a couple of the tweets, and I think we should turn over to the audience now and see what they have to say. Some of your tweets. Refreshing to hear, this is from Neil Mortensen, refreshing to hear Brian Cox talking about TV's positive influence on young people and on interest in science. Andy Livingston, I think Professor Brian Cox is absolutely right that absolute choice can lead us down very unfortunate silos. Brian Cox makes a good case for PSBs, this is from Mike Dix, to change culture. Maybe it's time for the BBC to do the BBC. This is where we see if I can move the page. The BBC Micro... No, it's gone altogether.
BBC Micro.
Micro.
Well,
did it end at Micro? I don't think it did.
Maybe it's a reference to what Eric Schmidt said last night, which I thought was very important, because the thing is, a public service like that can act in concert with government in that respect. I don't see any... That was a good example of the BBC Micro. It was wonderful. It was here's the thing, it's going to go into all schools, it's going to teach kids about computer programming. That's brilliant. Shouldn't we be able to do that? Why should we clip the wings of a broadcaster? Why is it not possible for the BBC to act in that way? Maybe it is, but it doesn't now. So it's an interesting question, actually.
Why isn't it possible for a broadcaster to act in that way, or why is it possible? Let's open it to you. Can we have some questions from the floor? Are you going to turn up the lights a little bit, or am I just going to peer?
Oh.
Thank you, that's better. Thanks. Hi.
Do you have any practical tips for lovies to learn about science? I mean, it kind of feels frustrating because you've already gone to university, but you know, it'd be great.
I think it's interesting. I did. I don't want to start that sentence. This is not a marketing plug. I've just finished a book on quantum mechanics. This is not a marketing plug, right? But I was asked
What's
by
it called?
A journalist called the Quantum University. Right? But I was asked by a journalist, you know, it's an attempt to really explain the theory. And they said, well, could you see this being taught in schools? And I said, well, yeah, actually. And the reason is that it's the same as programming, actually, as Eric Schmidt said last night. What do these things do? Quantum mechanics is philosophically difficult, but technically simple, actually. So the thing you learn by engaging in science, and this is our theory of everything other than gravity, it's absolutely mainstream physics, it tells you that your preconceptions about the world are not necessarily right. In other words, your opinion, your deeply held belief that if I pick that glass up and throw it, it will follow this perfect arc through the air. That's wrong, actually. I mean, just to do some science, quantum mechanics says that every atom in that glass, at every instant, is exploring the universe. Right? It's literally hopping to every point in the universe And they're all doing it simultaneously. And an emergent property is the thing we call a glass, and it sits there roughly where you put it. But the underlying physics is rather confusing. But what's interesting, though, that's not technically difficult. It's a great way of training yourself to just think a little bit differently, because nature forces you to do so. So maybe that's the value of science education, actually. It's not to know facts. It's to engage in this nice mental exercise about how should we think about the world, and that spans across all your thinking. So that would be my advice. It's kind of engage, not because you want to know how big an atom is or what a proton is or something, but just the process of unpicking the way the world works is actually fascinating.
But you're quite bullish about this, and I know you sort of believe that to say, oh, I just don't know anything about science, should be as unacceptable as saying, oh, I don't really bother wearing a seatbelt. Well, that's actually illegal, but that was
in my world,
your
it'd
example.
be illegal, yeah. No, it's right. I mean, I saw a politician, I won't name them, on Newsnight a few years ago, and they actually said that, and it was someone with responsibility for sort of education and things like that. And they actually said, well, of course, I don't really know anything about science. You would never see anyone in that position say, well, of course, I've never read Shakespeare. Of course, I've never listened to Mozart. Of course, I don't know the Beatles, even, whatever.
Ed Miliband hasn't taken any books on holiday with him.
Well, yeah, maybe they do now. Maybe. But in general, it's our culture has fragmented. It's gone into silos, as we've said before, and it's acceptable to disregard or have no knowledge of the thing that gave us modern civilization.
Is it better somewhere else? I mean, yes, we accept it, we're guilty, we're bad at it, and we are improving.
Well, are we though? One thing we have to be careful of in Britain is we are the second most successful scientific nation in the world by any measure. Second only to America, by any measure. Our universities are second only to the United States. Our efficiency is higher than anybody else. We invest less and get far more. The universities, we have the top 5 universities in Britain, are 5 of the best universities in the world. So it's important not to...
But what Eric Schmidt said last night is that we're brilliant at inventing and conceiving things, but we aren't very good at sustaining them and building... Google.
You accept that 40-odd% of our economy is based on it. So, we're not bad, actually, with the 6th biggest economy in the world. So it's that's the point. The point is we're a very strong foundation. And actually, you can carry this over to the media as well, as Eric said, very powerfully. We are the best. Right? It's clear. And one of the things that surprises me, actually, about the debate about the BBC, sorry, I was going to ask one question, but one of the things I wanted to say, actually, is that here is an institution that is clearly a big global brand, a powerful global brand, recognised as the best in the world in many areas. And to even, what the British disease is to even consider damaging that institution. I mean, I think parallels with the university sector are interesting. It's like Oxford and Cambridge. Can we conceive of saying we should dismantle those institutions? Maybe you wouldn't create them now. Maybe it's odd. Maybe it's a little bit elitist. Maybe it's strange. But you can't conceive of taking a world-leading brand and dismantling it. Whereas we do conceive of that with the BBC. And
but it's a bigger argument, isn't it? Because we conceive of that when the BBC starts becoming something other than this great citadel of learning that you describe it as, when it starts competing with Saturday night,
No, but it has to. I mean, it's a clear answer to that. It has to, otherwise it'll be a silo. So it can't be a silo. To perform its function, it needs to be able to get 6 million people to watch a science documentary. And not only science, everything else. So, I mean, I know there are complicated questions, but just, for me, the key thing is, because I'm not part of the media industry as such, I can look at it from outside to some extent. You can ask a higher level question, which is, what's the point of our media? Is it to generate shareholder value? What is it to do? Is it to compete? Is it to help change our society for the better as well? Yes, it is. And if you start from that, then you might get to different conclusions about what you do.
Questions? The lady over there, please.
You've mentioned that in terms of science programming, that bar charts and graphs and stuff are a bit of a distraction. You don't like it. Connected TV, do you think that that's going to make science programming a richer experience, or is it a distraction?
It's a good. I think it'll make it a richer experience. I mean, one of the one of the debates we've had around BBC4 actually, just chatted around it is, can you go more in depth on BBC4? Well, yes, probably you can. But actually, interestingly, maybe that becomes redundant in the sense that if you can provide that you can sit there with your iPad, as Eric said, and you can watch Wonders of the Solar System, but actually then there's a lot more rich, deep scientific content in there. Then maybe you can have a program that, it's easier to make a program that functions on all levels. I mean, that's what we try to do in my programs. We try and give something for the experts and as I said, also give permission to watch to anyone that wants to watch it. But I think it is a great opportunity that actually it will allow us to drive much more science into the programs. And the books do it at the moment, so we have the books with it and they do it, but live with the program on a tablet, let's say, I think it's a wonderful opportunity. But it's interesting, the funding model will have to allow you to spend time doing that. So it's more money, of course, because it's more content.
There's a couple more tweets here. Mark Allen, popular perception, BBC would make more money unshackled without license fee, but it would destroy others. Anthony Lilly, why no BBC micro V2? Because broadcasters think about market more than their cultural role, thus measure the benefit with wrong tools.
That's an interesting tweet. I mean, the BBC would make more money. To me, one of the strengths is it genuinely doesn't, in the programming only, so when we go and sit down to think about what we're going to do with the next Wonders of Life or whatever, the money making is not in the conversation. I genuinely can say that. It's not that I'm shielded from it, because I have a huge say over the way the content works.
But you must be the only programme that the BBC makes where money making is not considered a...
Staying within budgets in the conversation, but it's not, well, how do we maximise the commercial return of this programme? In fact, actually quite the opposite. It really is, the conversation I have is, how do we maximise the cultural impact of this programme? So I don't really agree. There's clearly there's room for everything, but there has to be room for that. There has to be room for that ethos.
Does anyone here from the BBC want to comment on that, or anyone from another broadcaster? Do you have meetings about how much you can maximise the cultural impact of your programme?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Hello, anyone like to say anything?
I'm not saying that no one thinks. I mean, obviously everyone's. I mean, I work. Obviously, we have directors who work with me who work in the commercial sector as well, and they, whatever they're doing for whatever broadcaster or whatever production company, they want to make a beautiful piece of television. Obviously, that's true. But I'm just saying that I think that pressure isn't there. So I'm just challenging that particular tweet, that it would necessarily be better if you allowed the BBC to function as a commercial operation. And obviously it'd be a powerful one because it's got this astonishingly powerful brand. But I think you'd lose something that you wouldn't get back. And also, of course, you'd fill the commercial space with another competitor, wouldn't you? There's
a question here from Edski95 Ed Sayer. Do you think ITV should be doing more science programming, or should it just be left to the BBC, Channel 4, 5 and Sky One?
No, I'd love to see ITV do more science programming, because I think that, as I said, I just don't accept the distinction. It's either a good program or it isn't. And I think hopefully that's what programs like Wonders, and also, Earth, Power of the Planet, I mean, these are things that got 3 million plus viewers. Hopefully they've demonstrated that you can get prime time level audiences with that kind of content because it's a good program.
More questions from the floor? There's a quote from this gentleman here.
Hi, I was just wondering, television and television programs have certain constraints about them. They need to be entertaining, they need to fit within a certain format, and you only have 60 minutes to get a message across. You talked about the importance of science and having a society that understands science. Do you think that science on TV can be an effective mechanism to educate society to make the key kind of important decisions about the future of our society?
Yes, but you're right that you can't teach an audience about the intricacies of climate change, let's say, in an hour. You can't do it. But what you can do is show what the scientific method is. You can show what the scientific project is, as it were. So, and that's the important thing. I mean, Carl Sagan wrote about this. There's a great book called The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark, where he makes this point that you don't really, obviously you can't teach someone about the intricacies of climate modelling. It's very, very complicated. But you can say, well, this is the process, right? So it can show you how to weight the scientific consensus. I think you can be familiar with the process, you can see what it's done, you can see how science is done, and I think that is something you can show quite impressionistically and quite quickly, actually, and that's where the real value is. And then also, of course, driving people deeper, so then you might go and get some books, and what we've seen potentially is not only that, but with some kids, they've watched the part of the input of these science programs has been to say, I'll go and do it at university. Maybe that, that seems as though it may have been true.
We've got time for one more question from the floor. Is that? Oh yes, there, just here.
Toby Morse from Sleepy Dog. How important is science fiction to science? I mean, there's some great science fiction has been written, which really explores science and introduces people. Some of it is, really takes away and glosses over too much. Yeah. What's your view? Where do you stand on that?
I think it's very important. It was very important to me. I mean, actually, when I was growing up as a kid, I couldn't really tell the difference. And when I was born in '68, so Star Wars was there and Star Trek was on. The Apollo program was just tailing off. They did Space Shuttle in the '80s. So I actually think it feeds into the excitement. Doctor Who is a good example. I mean, you'll find a lot of kids that watch my programs are big Doctor Who fans as well, and that's a good thing. I think science and science fiction feed off each other beautifully.
And Einstein said that the human mind is not capable of comprehending the universe. Is it your mission to prove him wrong?
He proved himself wrong. He did very, very well. So yeah, I don't agree with him, but I don't think he believed that, actually.
And I just wonder, I mean, you get very, very emotional when as we watch you on screen about the wonder of the universe and the solar system, and soon we'll be watching you expressing wonder about life. As a scientist, isn't that sort of irrational emotion supposed to be the enemy of rational science? And are there things that you still feel are things of wonder completely unexplained, perhaps inexplicable?
No, I think that the basis, if you ask scientists, I ask myself, why did I want to do science? It's based on an emotional reaction to nature, right? At its heart, it's looking at nature and saying, that's beautiful and it's fascinating and there's something to be explained. I'm interested. It's an emotional reaction. And I think that's what you need to remember. And that's why in my programs they're made, there's some level of that in them, because I believe that. It's, why am I interested in the stars? Right? Why is it? Because the same reason everybody's interested in the stars, because it's an emotional reaction. And then what you do with that emotion is you might say, well, I want to know what they are. And then off you go, and that means you're a scientist then. So it's part of the process.
You've been likened to David Attenborough. Would that be a sort of career path that you could see yourself emulating? Because you are heading for the wonders of life next, and I do imagine you're going to be under a few thorn bushes looking at little creatures. And
when I'm running BBC Two.
Now we have another bit.
The landscape.
At last.
so I don't know. I mean, how can anyone answer that?
Well, I hope you'll allow a couple of lovely programs into your schedule still when you're running BBC Two. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Cox.